Plain Tempest podcast, we have Eric Kaufmann, and he's just written a book about the origins of woke. It's called Taboo in the UK, isn't it?
That's right.
Okay, so do you want to give a little premise of that?
Paula, sure. So the book is really about it's about the woke phenomenon, the origins, the effects of it, how it affects society and politics, and what to do about it, really. That's really the key, in a sense, that there's obviously been a lot of books out on this. This book is very much looking at the social science and the data behind this and also proposing quite a few solutions, what I call a 12-point plan for addressing this cultural revolution, really. And so now, again, because there have been quite a few books on this, it's important to stress that what's different about this book is that it doesn't locate the rise of woke necessarily within cultural Marxism, within people like Herbert Marcuse and Paulo Freire and Angela Davis and all of it. It's so the idea that the people who wanted to overthrow society through Marxist revolution got disillusioned with class and turned to identity is part of the story. So it's definitely something that I think is, and Chris Rufo makes that case, and in their various ways, Francis Fukuyama, Yascha Mounk, a number of others also make that case that ideas of intellectuals, particularly cultural Marxist intellectuals, Gramscian type cultural Marxist who sort of talked about a war of position of taking over institutions deliberately, recruiting their own and therefore eventually shaping young minds. Now, that's part of what's going on. So I don't want to discount that theory. But what I want to say is that what my book emphasizes is the crucial role played by the liberal left rather than the radical left. So the liberal left, which is the majority in most of our institutions, are motivated by a different set of considerations than overthrowing society or even envy and hatred of some ruling class. What
Mm.
they're motivated by is guilt, typically white guilt, possibly male guilt for sins committed in the past by their group, compassion for particular groups, typically race, gender, and sexual minorities, and also a catastrophizing alarmism around cultural conservatives, that they are essentially crypto-fascist. If you allow any slide in the direction of cultural conservatism, that will quickly land you back in 1933 Germany and with gays in the closet and women back in the home. So
Mm.
that's sort of those three aspects: the fear of conservatives, guilt over the treatment of marginalized groups in the past, compassion for those groups, which can kind of be subsumed under the very crude emotional binary, majorities bad, minorities good. That psychological complex, culture complex, is, in my view, the driver. And even where the cultural Marxists have made strides, as with talk of white privilege and
Mm.
systemic racism and gender ideology, which are undoubtedly coming out of critical theory, they have only managed to make strides because of a very fertile demand coming from the left liberals. And so without the left liberal sensibility, there's no way a majority of Seattle voters would have approved of defund the police. It's not
Mhm.
that those voters wanted to overthrow capitalism, it's that they had this majority bad, minorities good complex rooted in them.
Okay, interesting. So you're saying the the radicals are perhaps hijacking a benevolence in the liberal mindset and guiding it that way, do you think?
Well, I actually think the liberals are more than capable of doing it themselves. And
Mm.
so if you just look at DEI, diversity, equity, and
Mm.
inclusion policies, they are a blend of the cultural radicals and the left liberals. From cultural radicalism, we get uh, critical race theory,
Mm.
radical gender ideology. But from the left liberals, we get affirmative action, speech codes, diversity training, harassment, exaggerated harassment law, and this idea of disparate impact that if any policy affects a protected group more than another, it's ipso facto racist or sexist or whatever. So there's actually a mix, but I actually think the left liberal innovations are in some ways more powerful and more
Right.
prominent. As sort of annoying as the uh, radical race and gender ideology is, the guts of the DEI apparatus, which was already in place before the mid 2010s, comes out of left liberalism. So affirmative action, speech codes,
Mhm.
diversity training.
Do those things not actually, are they not included in what you might call an intersectional perspective? Would you call intersectionality a liberal or a radical perspective?
I think intersectionality is more radical.
Mm-hmm.
And again, a lot of these ideas coming from intellectuals are very radical,
Mm-hmm.
but a lot of the practices are, I think, informed by this sort of taken for granted majorities bad, minorities good, guilt,
Mm-hmm.
guilt empathy complex, which didn't require the big ideas from the
Right.
Judith Butlers and the Derek Bells and Marcuses.
Or the Kimberly Crenshaws, because I mean,
Or Crenshaw.
intersectionality is a kind of mashup of Derek Bell's kind of critical race theory, and Kimberly Crenshaw kind of borrowed a lot from Black radical feminism, which creates the kind of intersectional stack with Black women at the top and white men at the bottom.
Yeah.
But I mean, I can't see really the difference in it. I see all of the kind of intersectional what I intersectionality for me is woke. So and that is they just seem to be the same to me. I don't know how you would kind of pass them.
Well, I think something, if you look at the origins, for example, affirmative action, this idea of quotas by race, so that everything must represent the demographics of a, so it must be 50-50 male, female, or it must be 13%, Harvard must be 13% black because that's in the population. So I think that's a big part of the diversity equity agenda.
So
It,
it's proportional representation rather than 50-50 across the board.
no, what I mean is instead of merit and equal treatment, you have discrimination in order to achieve equal outcomes. So discrimination against white and Asian applicants to Harvard to achieve a Black and Hispanic share that looks like the population. That's just sort of one component of DEI. Now, would you call it woke? I would. My definition of woke really revolves around this idea of making sacred historically marginalized race, gender, and sexual identity
Mm-hmm.
groups. That's the one sentence definition of what woke is. From that stemmed two policies. One is uh, enforced equal outcomes through affirmative action. And the second is a hypersensitivity to essentially protecting those minority groups from psychological harm, what's now known as emotional safety, what used to be known as minority self-esteem. You do that through clamping down on free speech and scientific truth. Anything that offends those groups must be essentially suppressed. And that's where we get the attack on free speech. Yeah.
That's
So
interesting. Sorry.
no, I just would argue that a lot of the impetus behind those policies does not actually come from the Kimberly Crenshaws or the Derek Bells of this world, but really, if you trace the history,
Mm-hmm.
the rise of affirmative action under the Johnson administration in the United States extended under the Nixon administration. This was partly about Black groups making a lot of political fuss and this being carried in the media, the liberal left becoming very enamored of that cause,
Mm-hmm.
the
Mm-hmm.
threat of violence and inner city rioting, all of that helped to condition the kinds of policies around that. The Supreme Court then contorted the law to make what it originally said was no discrimination on the basis of race, and eventually
Mm-hmm.
what it led to was you must discriminate on the basis of race.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So all of this comes really before, I think, without any real input from cultural Marxism at all, from intersectionality, from critical theory, from any of it. It's already in place really by the late 60s, early 70s. And then similarly, I think for the speech code move, which is all about policing what you're allowed to say on campus, which also in corporations and organizations is it becomes around policing speech of employees and
Mhm.
firing employees for speech and all of that. Again, the origins of this is really around, much more around minority self-esteem and multiculturalism rather than these kind of more radical critical theory ideas, which are basically saying, well, we need to police speech because free speech from majorities upholds some invisible quote unquote structure, whether it be white supremacy or patriarchy, which is
Mhm.
unequal. Therefore, we must get rid of speech. Well, and that's the Marcuse kind of argument. I don't think that was really the big driver when it came to speech codes. It was much more about hurt feelings and inclusion, which is much more that therapeutic liberal humanitarianism rather than the radicalism. So yeah, again, I really want to bring out this kind of left liberal humanitarian psychotherapeutic stuff, which has a different origin, I think, from the Marcuse Bell kind of Crenshaw
Yeah.
critical theory.
Okay, so that's, I mean, for me as an evolutionary psychologist, my first premise is always going to be human nature, and ideologies are tools for humans to gain evolutionary fitness and power, however that happens. But it's interesting you talk about self-esteem there, because minority self-esteem, because you're a social scientist, yeah?
Social scientists, yeah.
So you heard of the Black self-esteem advantage?
No,
No? This is something. It's one of the most replicated findings in social science, and since the 50s, Black self-esteem is higher than any other race.
right.
And I know you were talking about this. I know Jordan Peterson was saying self-esteem is a kind of woolly thing. He's talking about neuroticism. But what's interesting about that as well is that, yeah, Blacks have the higher self-esteem, but there's no sex difference either. Women have probably higher self-esteem than Black men. So it's interesting that kind of looking at
That's
what
interesting.
liberals
That's
might
really
be.
interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, part of this is exactly so. A lot of this is an ideological construction. So the
Mm-hmm.
ideology of the liberal left, well, of the cultural left, which includes the radicals and the liberal left,
Mm-hmm.
very much constructs minorities as fragile and
Mm.
as having low self-esteem and therefore needing to be protected from speech. And that is the sort of justification for the speech codes. Now, I wonder what they would respond if presented with your much more clinically
Yeah.
proven hard science results. I think they might say, "Oh well, the questions weren't asked right, and if you ask about they're just saying that or whatever." They'll make up some ad hoc
Yeah.
explanation. But
It's
that's
funny
interesting.
because for 80 years, I'm just looking at my
Yeah.
notes here. Consistently, people of sub-Saharan African lineage report higher well-being than people of Hispanic, Middle, and Northern European lineage. So yeah, I mean, for 80 years, and as I say, a lot of stuff in social science doesn't replicate, but this does. And the last paper I've looked on it is from 2023. Looking specifically at that sex similarity. It's not a difference, where Black women have now the highest self-esteem, higher than Black men in politics at the minute, certainly in certain people in there. If you look at kind of Tiffany Henyard, what's happening in there, and the corruption that's going on, and people just kind of like basically brazenly just presenting. But then if they're challenged, they regress back to, no, you're just being racist kind of thing.
Right. Right.
So
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah,
The facts are simply tools to be pressed into service where useful and
yeah.
hidden where not useful.
Uh-huh. So this is where my hypothesis comes in, because it's like woke is more like a way to cheat against who you might think of as, well, first you recruit the oppressor, which from perspective of intersectionality, that would be white feminists. And then you make as you were saying, the oppressed sacred, and the oppressor has to defer to category, which we see. I'm coming at it from more of a human nature, and specifically a female psychological problem, because we've seen women come into the these areas of power and politics in the last 50 to 70 years. And the change has been, massive, really. So I'm just wondering about the invisible hand of female psychology also guiding this, as well as general liberal sentiments. What do you think about that?
Yeah, so I think and I had this conversation with Jordan Peterson, which I think it's important to prize apart two things.
Mm,
One is an ideology can move in a feminine direction, quite apart from whoever, even if every institution was 100% male.
mm,
Um, you can have ideologies move in a feminine direction. I mean, we've seen that to some degree already if you think about the origins of psychotherapy, even if you go back further and you think about the removal of dueling or the end of dueling or an honor culture,
mm.
that can be interpreted as a shift of the culture in a feminine direction, that you no longer have blood sports and
Are you saying
despite
women are more civilized?
well, this was the argument of the book, The Civilizing Process, which
Mm-hmm.
is by Norbert Elias about the kind of he would call, I guess they would say kind of feminization of society, but this is going back from even the introduction of table manners, the end of
Mm,
dueling, starting from the Middle Ages, moving into the modern period. So you could make an argument that civilization and feminization are kind of a process that it doesn't require women. But on the other hand, I think it's also fair to say that a more feminized ideology is going to resonate better with women. And so if there are more women in an organization, you'll get more support for these feminized ideologies.
mm-hmm.
I think in terms of we can see also a change among women. One being that, I mentioned that um, there's a survey of 18-year-old students who enter American universities, about
Mm-hmm.
100,000 a year. It's been done since 1970, and you can see women were a bit more conservative than men in 1970, starting in about 2004. Maybe that's the election of George W. Bush. I don't know, or maybe that doesn't matter, but women start to become a bit more liberal in their sympathies, like 18-year-old women versus 18-year-old men entering into universities.
That's not
And
a
now we're
process
at the
of,
point, yeah, we're
so
at the
that's
point
not a
now that
process.
gap's really widened out. It's
Yeah.
now 15 points
But is that a process of the education they get in universities, or was that just entering university?
entering. So this is before they've set foot on campus. Now, so women, an 18-year-old woman today is a lot more to the left of an 18 culturally
Mm-hmm.
compared to an 18-year-old woman in 2000 or 2005. And we see that, by the way, in the voting numbers in a number of different countries where if you take women and men over age 40, there's not much of a gender gap in terms of politics and ideology. Women under 30, there's a big and rising gender gap. So there's been a change in women is
Yeah.
part of what's going on is that young women are reflecting that something's happening in the socialization of young women that is making them much more liberal or left liberal.
Yeah.
So I think even though yes, the evolutionary psychology, which of course hasn't changed over time, but something in the messaging. So one of my hypotheses is that women will tend to back up the dominant ideology that is being propounded in a school or a university or a corporation, whatever, much more than men will.
Mm-hmm.
Uh,
Mm-hmm.
and so what we have is, if we were in a very Catholic society, women would be in the forefront of being the most religious, which we know they have been in the past, much more religious than men.
Yeah.
Now we've got a new religion, and they are in the forefront of backing that up, whereas the contrarians who are perhaps offering a backlash or rebelling against it are more likely to be male.
Yeah.
I
Most of my
suppose that's
followers are men.
how
Yeah.
I sort of think of it. So even in the police or even in sections of the military or security establishment, you have wokery. And even though there'll be very few women in those institutions, but of course, in a university psychology department or something that is heavily female,
Mm-hmm.
because the ideology resonates better with them, those departments are going to be more saturated. But I don't think the demographic shifts per se are the main cause of this. That's what I'm saying is sort of because women have changed a lot, that's partly due to the ideological winds, the dominant ideology in society has really shifted.
Culture. The culture is much more
Yeah.
saturated with feminist ideas.
Yes, yeah. And perhaps it's interacted with the rising share of women to make certain institutions just extremely
Mm.
woke. But I would say the bigger part of it is just this shift in the culture, which is one of the reasons why if we can shift the culture back, even if the share of women remains as it is,
Mm-hmm.
I actually think we could fix the problem.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Because it's interesting. Yeah. The literature and kind of female psychology is that women gravitate to authority figures much more than kind of boys do, and that women's lives are focused on the lives of others as well. So that tunes it in with the idea of trying to kind of perhaps a little bit of social engineering there and speech codes.
I should say one other things
Mm-hmm.
about empathy. So women are
Mm-hmm.
more empathetic, but the point about empathy is and this is a point made by Paul Bloom of Yale in his book.
I did that course about 10 years ago.
Oh, did you? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you look at empathy, it all depends on who the target is, right? And
Absolutely. I
uh,
mean, empathy is the wrong word because empathy is more like a theory of mind. I think kind of
yeah.
when Paul kind of talks more about sympathy and compassion. Empathy isn't sympathy and compassion. Empathy can be absolutely gamed by tribalism,
Yeah.
and often is. That outliers are kind of dehumanized, and there's a decision just to not have compassion or sympathy for outliers, and certainly our current political situation definitely it shows that.
Yeah, because I think, it's a lot of these are actually clashes of rights. Should we have sympathy for someone who wants to transition or sympathy for someone who's detransitioning,
Mm-hmm.
a criminal or a victim of crime,
Mm.
transgender person wants to enter a women's space, or the women in that space who don't want a male in that space? I mean, those are actually clashes of rights, but the ideology says, no, you must forget about the detransitioner, the victim of crime, forget about the women who don't want the biological male in their sports team,
Mm-hmm.
who actually, here's where I want you to direct your compassion. And here's the group that I want you to either forget about or actually be hostile towards. So the ideology is actually the rail switchman that is sort of directing the empathy. So I think just saying, oh, well, women are more empathetic doesn't actually tell us very much.
No,
It's
it doesn't.
how's the ideology manipulating that and in what direction? That's all.
No, definitely. There's been a few books written about, like the future is female. We need to have more women inside institutions to make them more peaceful, more cooperative, all this kind of thing. And the fact is, that's just an assumption. Okay. Women are just as competitive as men, but they compete in different ways, much more covert ways. There's no kind of science that would say that women are better, kinder, or just as there's no science that would say that men are better, that we have different propensities, evolutionary propensities,
Hmm.
to help us negotiate our fitness within the kind of environment that we're born into. But the idea that women somehow have a superior moral code, I think, is very dangerous at the minute, especially in, as you were saying, the culture of affirmative action. If we're just putting women in there for the sake of them being women, but they're not actually there by a process, they're not actually any better at the job, then the invisible hand of female psychology will begin to express itself. It's like social media, cancel culture seems to me like maps onto the strategies of female competition and aggression really well, which is basically social ostracism.
Right.
And that, so cancel culture seems to me as manifest female psychology in those kind of strategies of competition. And that's kind of what interests me about it. And a lot of people think I'm a misogynist. I'm not,
Right.
all my perspective is that we've had 5,000 years ever since the recording of history to study male intersexual competition from the Iliad to Jack Reacher. We know all about it. We know how to guard against the excesses of it. We know the strategies that are going to be used. We have Machiavelli. These books they take up vast libraries in the world. There's about one shelf in a very modern library that is about strategies of female competition. Another thing, Joyce Bennison says this. Joyce Bennison's a behavioral psychologist who writes a lot on female psychology and female intersexual competition.
No, but you make this point about the competition within groups, say within women, within men.
Yeah, well, there's always more competition within a group than there is without. So feminism concentrates on the competition between men and women. But actually, that's not the biggest problem. I call it the pink elephant in the feminist room, is female intersexual competition. And this is why we have radical feminists and intersectional feminists now at each other's throats, white feminists, black feminists. They are all, well, the white feminists, the middle-class feminists, they're all kind of elite women because most women aren't feminists at all. We are Lumpenfrau. So most of these elite women are battling for status with other elite women at the cost of the Lumpenfrau, basically, because hardly any of the policies, certainly today, are actually benefiting women in their lives. No, women don't want to dismantle patriarchy, whatever that might be. They're quite happy. They want to, just to kind of do what they do, get up, and raise their families. But of course, a lot of women now, because of feminism, aren't actually having families, which is, we'll talk about kind of solutions a bit later. But I have my own kind of ideas on that as well. So, yeah. And
one thing I was just going to, it's fascinating what you were saying there about competition within, because it strikes me, and again, this is not my focus, but I haven't seen a ton of academic work on splits within women. Even to the point where we know, if you take, say, in political science, we know that the female vote is heavily split. Let's say the support for Trump, women who stay at home and don't have a career are a significant pro-Trump voting bloc. In the data, it is really striking. Whereas career women, particularly single women, will be very much for Harris. Whereas we tend to just get literature on, female versus male, gender gap in support for very different candidates, but we never really, there's not much focus on the much wider gaps within, say, women, but, on these lines. So you rarely hear from those non-career women. Not many people seem to write papers or express a whole lot of interest.
Not in social psychology, no. In evolutionary psychology, we do.
Okay.
And the vast amount of evolutionary psychologists are women, although that is taking a kind of feminist turn at the minute. But it began, that Lida Kosmides was one of the founders, Margot Wilson, lots of absolutely great, fantastic women, Sarah Blaffer Hardy. We really need to kind of look and understand female competition and intersexual competition and how it's manifesting within the culture, because obviously male intersexual competition creates wars. Okay. That's the kind of ultimate kind of politics kind of tries to mediate this competition with dialogue. But most of the time, and this is another finding in the literature, women deny that they're in competition with other women.
Right.
There's kind of a self-deception, and they genuinely believe that they're not in competition. But they're also very hyper-vigilant. This is what the introduction of social media, where women can watch and see. You'll find, women kind of stalk their friends online. And if somebody doesn't like one of their posts, they're really upset about it. So it's a tribalism. You need to back me up in there. And also watching for people who just don't play by the rules. If you're a woman who is openly competitive, you're liable to be ostracized by the groups. And women tend to have small groups, almost like substitute kin groups, and people come and go in them all the time with a queen bee.
Okay.
And men obviously have much wider groups like that to actually achieve short-term goals one after the other, whereas women kind of have one long-term goal, and they're just. But the self-deception thing is really interesting. like I say, ask any woman if she competes with her best friend or this, that, and the other, and they'll absolutely deny it. But it absolutely happens. It really does.
But I mean, I guess following on from that, from what you were saying, the other aspect of this is that there are these splits within women, let's just say. Um, and I guess from my point of view, it seems like the voice of one section of
Mm.
of women is amplified in the public debate, in the media, in
Or
the public space,
yeah, overrepresented.
vastly
Yeah.
more than another. Well, whereas at least with men, you could say, okay, yes, the university educated liberals have the stronger voice, but on the other hand, there is a kind of populist voice as well. And I just think, and it's recognized there are class divisions as well. It seems to me that for women, particularly these divides between career and non-career, single, not as much the single mare, but certainly the career and non-career. I mean, that doesn't seem to be, you don't hear much from normie kind of women who just want to have a family or that is not a group that is involved and represented anywhere in politics. Whereas I think with men, you definitely have the non-university
Mm-hmm.
or populist type. They do have a voice, even if it is somewhat muted, but they're
Mm-hmm.
pushing at the door. Whereas I don't sense any activity on behalf of those silent kind of women who
Oh,
might,
I'm
yeah,
doing
yeah,
it. That's but because I actually hypothesize that feminism isn't ultimately, because obviously you're aware of the proximate motives and ultimate motives, kind of like
Mhm.
they sometimes seem like opposite, but they're actually going towards kind of an evolutionary fitness for the individual. And so feminism, whatever it says, it kind of hides behind this kind of these tropes like women's rights, equality, fairness. But actually, equality seems to me a way to keep low status people in their place while the elites who made up the rules cheat. Okay. So it's kind of on the surface, it's reasonable. And this is kind of something that JFK Jr. was talking about recently when he said suddenly it's become okay to kind of judge people by their intentions and not their actions or outcomes. And this is all kind of in the hashtag kind of thing. So this is what feminism does. It kind of presents itself. Sorry.
Do you mean, for example, that the outer messaging is that we're all about equality between men and women, but what's hidden is the inequality within women between the elite women and
Yeah,
the rest. That
because
is
it's
so,
all women, all women.
right.
They. This is basically the general rule that groups women have between themselves. We're all equal, so that's kind of extending out towards men as
Right.
well. But of course, women in these groups, they'll deny hierarchies exist, but they do. They're just covert, hidden, and usually very very hard to kind of climb up. If you're at the bottom of the hierarchy, say somebody's probably going to die before you work your way up there. And then we see that in kind of primates. So yeah, feminism is a front really, and it's unconscious. I think most feminists really think they are trying to help, but what they don't, I mean, everybody today kind of thinks, oh, we're very sophisticated, we're not driven by evolutionary propensities or anything, we're kind of like we've cut the shackles of evolution. But what I see is actually those ignorant of evolution are the ones most enslaved by it. So what we have is kind of under a proximate trope of equality. Let's say feminism has devalued motherhood, which is kind of running interference on other women's reproductive fitness. And we've seen the birth rate drop. So whatever they say, they're trying to liberate women, liberate them from what? Women's rights, all this kind of thing. All of the talk is about helping, fairness, blah, blah, blah. But actually, when you look at the outcomes, what you're seeing is it's not actually men or the patriarchy that have suppressed female or have gained power over women's fertility. It's feminism. And they've suppressed that fertility to an extent and pushed women into what we'd call a male life history
Hmm.
strategy, whereas men in their 20s and 30s seek resources in order to attract women, the best mates. So when feminists put women in that position, the women use their reproductive prime years to do that, reach their mid-30s, and then the resources don't actually help them get the mates that they want, because the mates that they want are actually marrying women who are in their reproductive prime. So it's kind of, it's a false promise. It's pushing women into, and of course they can't do anything about it then, really. I mean, a lot are lucky, but when they have IVF and things like that, but a lot aren't. So it's
So in a way, I think we would agree that the effects of feminism are negative for women's happiness and flourishing.
And that's empirical as well, because female depression is gone up,
especially among younger women. But I think that where there might be a disagreement, or at least a question mark, is around what's driving this. And I suppose my as a sort of social science, sociologist, political scientist, I sort of come from this sociology of emotions perspective, which would argue that culture is kind of in the driver's seat more than evolutionary psychology. And of course, they're both at play. But so, for example, the sociology of emotions would suggest, well, we can repress evolutionary psychology if the ideology tells us to repress, say, a desire to have kids, whatever it is. That can be repressed, and other emotions can be expressed. And so, for example, so that would suggest then the system of ideas we live in is extremely important. And so, for example, if we talk about these feminists, they're not, you wouldn't say that they are getting all the desirable men.
No.
What you might say is they're having a negative effect on a lot of women.
But one of their proximate aims is to destroy patriarchy, which is the family, one of their stated aims of feminism. This is where kind of ultimate and proximate kind of, they're getting something they want, but also the invisible hand of evolution is taking them down a path that they have no idea what they're doing.
Right. But the reason they want it is because they've been infected by a mind virus, which is really culture. The mind virus is telling them that virtue is to do with smashing the patriarchy and pushing women into these, what you call male life course choices. So valuing career, etc., over having a family, which causes a lot of the unhappiness. But I think at the heart of this is this mind virus and this culture that is getting women to suppress their various urges, which are evolutionary. So in a way, this is where I think it's important to understand the idea complex we are bathed in, which can manipulate our psychology and has an independent existence from our psychology. And so, I'm not sure that these women, these feminists, are necessarily even themselves gaining from I mean, they're obviously going to, the ones who are at the top, like a Judith Butler, may be able to make a career and make some money and get a reputation and be a virtue signaler. So there's a certain status, perhaps, that they can achieve in some domains. But in a way, the women who are following them the most are probably losing the most, and the ones that are rejecting them are actually able to enjoy more happiness. And we can see that in the correlations that women who are more far left have a lower happiness, dramatically lower happiness than women who are conservative. So in a way, it's not benefiting individuals, but it is a negative for human flourishing overall.
Yeah. It might be benefiting, a lot of these famous feminists like Judith Butler are lesbian. They're actually looking to get female mates. So, and also the women coming behind them, I mean, I would call them kind of ideological cannon fodder, because they're missing out on leaving a biological legacy, and they're getting this message that, go girl, you can make a change in the culture and all this, but they can't. It's even harder to make a lasting legacy in the culture than it is to biologically. So they're losing out. They're not leaving any biological legacy. They're not leaving any cultural legacy. It's the end of millions of years of their ancestors took them to this point, and it ends with them, really. All of the strugglings and all of the, barely imaginable kind of things that their ancestors went through for that person to be there, then suddenly kind of this mind virus infects them, and that's the end of that evolutionary legacy. That's the end of that.
Yeah. I mean, of course, the birth rate issue, family formation issue is related to feminism, but of course there are also, you look at the East Asian fertility pattern where it's less feminist, but they have very low birth rate. So there's also
Mhm.
just uh, competition in general for material things and
Yeah.
delaying of
Mhm.
fertility. But I know, have no doubt, but clearly, if you look within a society, the more feminist women are having fewer kids than the less feminist women. And so now, obviously, it depends what we mean by feminism. There's the issue of having you can have a career and not be a feminist,
Mhm.
but on in general, yeah, I
You can't have a
think
career and not call yourself a feminist, though.
right, right.
Probably.
But I think this is where I think a lot of these aspects of woke. So in a way, I talk about woke as making sacred of historically marginalized groups, which would be racial minorities, women, sexual minorities,
Mhm.
and in all of those cases, you can see something negative coming through the overreach. So values which did some good, initially in
Mhm.
producing more equality and opportunity, but then on the other hand, they then overreach.
Yeah.
And that's really
Mhm.
where the book is talking about it. So the more we've gone from simply opening up opportunities for women to essentially trashing men and moving in the direction of radical feminism, that's actually had a lot of negative impacts. And
Mhm.
similarly on the race front, going from racial equality to a situation where you have affirmative action and you're telling minorities that they can never succeed because
Mhm.
their whole life is in the hands of a white person, and that's very
Mhm.
disempowering. And I've in fact done experimental work, survey experiments, which show that if you get an African American to read a passage of Ta-Nehisi Coates talking about, abuse of the black body by the white law enforcement,
Mhm.
whatever, it disempowers people and it makes them think they can't make their life plans work out. And so the persistent failure of left-wing
Mhm.
policy towards uh, black people, towards indigenous people since the 60s. Most of the gains were registered with
Mhm.
civil rights in that more liberal, classical liberal phase. And as we've moved into the sort of more left liberal radical phase, we have
Mhm.
actually just seen no progress. In fact, we've seen regress.
Yeah.
And something similar, you could say, perhaps with women, particularly younger women, that now we're starting to see the dark side of a
Yeah.
lot of these ideologies. The further they are taken, the more extreme, the trans stuff. Similarly, it's one thing to be tolerant of homosexuality, but once you move into encouraging deviance in a way, you're going to get all of these negative
Mhm.
impacts. Because ultimately, the society, it needs to be tolerant of difference, but it needs to maintain a norm,
Mhm.
which must include family formation, which must include having, normal two-parent families, which have the best outcomes in so many ways.
Mhm.
And
Not
that's
making the
essentially,
normal case a
yeah.
deviant kind of
Yeah,
case.
making the deviant into the norm really
Yeah.
immiserizes the whole. It's a bit like the example of if you have a sports team with some weak players. I mean, you can give the weak players a turn. If I use the metaphor of ice hockey, which being Canadian, you can give them some ice time. But if you actually suddenly make your weakest players into the ones who are your starters,
Mhm.
it's going to go downhill pretty quickly. So you can have some equality, but it's got to be checked by letting
Yeah.
merit rise to the top, letting whatever, and everybody benefits from the strong players getting more ice time. That actually percolates down to those weaker players and they can enjoy in the team's success. So similarly, for society, you have to allow mainstream people to have mainstream families, and then
Mhm.
that success will create a better society with less crime, more harmony, more wealth, which will trickle also down to those from minorities. But
Mhm.
that is not the outcome. So it's a bit kind of like similar to the problem of the Cold War between socialism
Mhm.
and capitalism in a way that you have to have some redistribution and some welfare state, but you can't have a socialist society where you demand equality or else you will become a miserable society. And so
Well,
the
yeah,
same
and
holds
of
for
course that
culture.
that is ultimately
Yeah.
an ideology that promotes kind of fairness and all this kind of thing, but ends up with a massive elite and everybody else is destitute. But I've got a really good example about what you're talking about, kind of in sports and things like that. Have you been following what's been happening in the WNBA, the women's basketball teams in
Not really. I
in the
vaguely remember
States.
some story on this.
Yeah, well, it's absolute classic female intersexual competition because Caitlin Clark is a phenomena, and because she's white, and well, they say it's because she's white. I think it's just because she's fantastic and she's the star, and she's not equal, right? She's
Right.
not part of the team. So they kept her on the bench for the Olympics. They would have rather lost the Olympics than
Right.
put their star
I
player
remember this now. I
in
remember this now.
in the
Yes.
team because isn't,
She,
they say it's because she's not lesbian, she's not minority, all this kind of thing. But it's more to the fact that she is very meritocratus in
yes.
her kind of approach to things. You just wouldn't see that in a male sports team where they have their stars, the other people are there to kind of back up the star and help the team win. Whereas because Caitlin Clark's kind of risen to this level above the other players, she has to be knocked down like tall poppy syndrome.
But equally, I think that is, if we had a women's basketball team in 50 years ago, I don't think you would see this because, I mean, I think a lot of this is coming from the dominant ideology in
Yeah, that's
society, from
intersectionality.
whoever is narrating this team, whoever is organizing this team, and the women and the players are picking up and reflecting that
Mm-hmm.
back to
Yeah.
elites.
And
And so
again, you
it's
can see the confidence in the black players as well. You can see this high level of self-esteem. And I'm calling it kind of chauvinism. There's been a lot of talk about kind of the degree of how narcissism plays into this, but I think it's more a kind of chauvinism. I think, narcissism is a personality trait. Chauvinism is something that I think all humans are susceptible to, male or female. And the culture certainly will encourage that. So if you're in a culture that says, women are great, the future is female, it's going to, there's hardly any women on earth that are not going to go, oh yeah, I like that. Even non-feminists, you know what I mean? So
right,
it's kind of
right.
like, we're all go, oh yeah, yeah, we're good. We're great. Yeah, that's good. So
Yeah. Go ahead. Sorry, ahead.
no, that was it. It's
Well,
just,
I just think there is, however, a point that I make with regard to woke, which is that it is not strictly about identity politics. Like feminism, well, sorry, I should rephrase this. Woke is not strictly about if you're a member of an oppressed group leaning into your identity. Actually, it's more of a religion which tells you when to stand behind somebody else and when to stand in front. You have the
mm-hmm.
progressive stack or the privilege walk where you take
It's
pace.
very hierarchical, even though it pretends not to
Yeah.
be.
And so for example, um, why would a tribal woman who is really into their tribe of being a woman allow a biological male to say they're a woman? Why would they not protect their spaces? Why would they sort of allow a black feminist to divide the tribe? Wouldn't the emphasis, I mean, if you were really tribal, you would say, shut up, we're a tribe. Unity is number
Mm-hmm.
one. Your little concern about race is number two. Shut your mouth. And you see that a
Yeah.
bit, by the way, and this is where I would say that race is actually a bit higher up the totem pole in terms of sacredness, because that's really where it starts with Black Americans,
Mm-hmm.
and then Indigenous can be close to that. But to actually divide a Black or Indigenous movement, for feminists to divide the Black or Indigenous movement, much more difficult and much
Mm-hmm.
rarer. You don't see it.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas for minorities to divide a feminist movement,
Mm-hmm.
minorities can divide a gay movement. All of that you see all the time because feminists and gay women and gays are are a little bit further down the
Yeah.
point in terms of points.
Intersectionality, yeah, is
Yeah, they might be a sort of a 10 or a jack in the pack instead of an ace or a king. And
mm-hmm.
I think that's so it's important, I think, when thinking about this term identity politics, that's not actually what it is. For most, a lot of feminists are willing to actually to kowtow to trans, to kowtow to black feminists on the lines of race because they recognize that actually those people have more oppressive
Yeah.
points. And
I
so
wonder
they're
if that,
what they are is they're believers in this religion of
mm-hmm.
oppression rather than narrow female tribalists, I think.
I wonder if that difference in self-esteem between white women and black women has anything to do that. The black women can basically just kind of take that authority and then use it while using the kind of rhetoric of fairness and equality, but making their status, well, gaming that status of minority as if it somehow kind of makes them weaker, but actually they are predisposed to actually be stronger in confidence. So are kind of gaming that a little bit.
I mean, it's interesting. I mean, I think, they can silence a black woman can silence a white woman. I don't think a black woman can easily silence a black man. I'm just talking about moral power, moral
Mm.
authority. My interpretation of that is much more cultural, that the religious
Mm-hmm.
totem pole of the oppression Olympics totem pole simply puts race above
Mm-hmm.
sex, and therefore that's why race can trump sex. The race card trumps the sex card. The sex card can't really trump the race card, and so I just think that's why there's moral power flowing in the way it is, rather necessarily than some of these sort of competitive mechanisms. It's not to say I would exclude those
Mm-hmm.
entirely, but I just think you have
Mm-hmm.
to understand this is a ethical religious system. It's a religion, and we live in it.
Mm-hmm.
And those who live more intensely in it abide by its rules. Although it's obviously interesting, the gender critical feminists are more tribally women. They are properly identity politics people.
Mm. Yeah.
And so they're resisting the religious feminists who are really about woke religion, number one, and their tribe as being women, number two. And so that's maybe the split within feminism.
The identity, sorry, the gender critical feminists, the old fashioned radical feminists.
Yeah, they put being a woman first, whereas the trans feminists would put the woke religion first, which tells them that they must
Mm-hmm.
defer to someone with more oppression points, which is the
Yeah.
trans
I mean,
woman.
I've done a little bit of research on that, and
Yeah,
it's odd because there were like gender critical feminists, even back in the 70s. But feminism did introduce the concept of gender itself into the kind of lexicon, which they started the fire basically, and now
right,
they want dibs for putting it out, which is kind of
right.
ironic. It's kind of the postmodern chickens come home to roost.
Yeah, no, that is interesting. You're right.
But also, I mean, I did a little bit of how in radical feminism, it's in one of my articles. It's called the Cure for Feminism is Not Feminism. So I was looking at kind of the articles in Spare Rib and the evolution of Spare Rib over research on a certain time and how it turned from radical into intersectionalism. And they were talking about we're taking the criticisms from Black feminists that we're all middle class and blah 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 really seriously. So we're going to allow third world feminists, I think they were called them at that time, into our non-hierarchical businesses. But pretty soon, they weren't non-hierarchical. Pretty soon, the kind of the Black feminists had completely taken over it, and then the pro-like Palestinian this started to come in. Yeah, they kind of opened the door, saying, this is non-hierarchical. Please come in. We want to share. And well, it didn't work out well for them. So
Yeah.
yeah, a lot of radical feminists now are lesbian feminists fighting for a lesbian identity. But as far as everything else that intersectionality stands for, like fighting patriarchy, the heterosexual family, they're still completely on board with that. It's only really the kind of like the identity thing that they're against because it takes away their own identity as lesbians.
Yeah, I mean, it is fascinating. I mean, I suppose because you really have these two things. One is just identity as a female, or if you want to, maybe as a lesbian, if it's about sisterhood,
And
versus
there is no sisterhood.
right, versus this broader religion of victimhood, which valorizes victimhood and attacks, so-called oppressors.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that sort of victimhood culture, which is really the culture within these groups, it's very much the victimhood culture. I don't know if you saw, I mean, there have been a number of pieces, including in the New York Times by Tom Edsall, talking about the collapse of how progressive organizations just collapsed into this infighting because they have no agreed upon
Yeah.
hierarchy. And if there is a hierarchy, it's simply based upon victimhood. And so whoever makes the loudest, first of all, whoever has the most
Mm-hmm.
points in the intersectional victim hierarchy tends to get their way. Once
Yeah.
everybody has acceded to victimhood culture, then anyone who makes a victimhood claim and has more points wins. And so it makes these organizations ungovernable. And that's actually even a point that was made of organizations back through time on the left. I mean, there's a book, and I'm struggling now to remember, but talking about, say, 1980s gender studies, even going back to the 19th century and looking at anarchist communes and how, everyone would say, well, nobody is above anybody else, but then inevitably you need to have some kind of hierarchy to make efficient decisions. And so the whole thing collapses and some strong personality seizes control or the whole thing. I mean, it's quite interesting, this problem of authority in anarchist type communal experiments.
Yeah.
And so this is again, because in a way, woke it does have, there are three aspects of woke. One is the expressive individualist or, the liberal strand. The other is the humanitarian, and the other is the egalitarian. And so you have a kind of anarchism is perhaps best matched. I mean, it's not exactly coterminous, but if we were to take a 19th century ideology that matches best with woke, it's probably anarchism.
Mm.
And so, you can see that anarchism, like even now, if you take far left groupings, the communist Marxist ones are not arguably as successful anymore,
No.
whereas Antifa, which is an anarchist inspired group, is very popular and successful. And I think that's because it meshes very well with this kind of anti-hierarchical cultural form of the left, which has been
Mhm.
dominant since the new left came in the late 60s.
Yeah, I'm just looking through my notes because there's something in one of the narcissism literature. I'm trying to find it. I thought I had. It's something called something like in every ideology, however well meant, it's vulnerable to be overtaken by cheaters and the people who have less than virtuous intentions. And Harvey Weinstein was a feminist.
Right, right.
So these people hide behind the tropes and then exploit their propensities within that environment. So,
Yeah, I mean, I suppose it's interesting because obviously Jordan or yourself or others who come from the psychology tradition
mm-hmm,
are focusing on certain things, and that intersects in different ways with sociologists, political scientists like myself who focus
mm-hmm,
more on culture. Um,
mm-hmm,
and so, for example, I wouldn't be as focused on who are the small minority of bad actors
mm-hmm,
with the dark triad traits that are dominating these concrete movements, but I might be more focused on who are the kinds of people that are essentially buying into the message,
mm-hmm,
um, a cultural message of victimhood and hostility towards mainstream norms. Why is that so appealing to a significant chunk of people, which might be as high as a third of, young people, a significant, or even a half of young people in some cases, or even if we take a question like, should someone who says transgender is a mental disorder or BLM as a hate group, should they be allowed on campus? 70 to 80% of American undergraduates
mm-hmm,
saying no. That's a clear majority of those young people that are
mm-hmm.
anti-free speech. So these norms,
Before their frontal lobes are fully developed as
yeah,
well.
yeah, but that's I'm sort of looking at the mass phenomenon here. How
Mm-hmm,
is it that a third or a half or three
mm-hmm,
quarters are buying into something that is clearly either illiberal or is an attack on social cohesion of the
mm-hmm,
civilization. And so maybe we're slightly just focused on different aspects of the problem. So my focus is, how do we lower that number?
mm-hmm,
So give the advantage back to those who would like to reinstitute, let's just say, norms, which I would call cultural holism or human flourishing norms that will make
mm-hmm.
society happier, more harmonious, better,
Yeah.
freer, and what to do about it, which is sort of why I focus a lot on the different strategies that, particularly conservatives, because I think only this change has to start and can only come from conservatives first.
Mm-hmm,
as they achieve success, that will allow the centrists and center leftists to start to win battles in their own coalition to say,
Hmm.
if we lean into this woke stuff, we're going to lose elections. Please get rid of it.
Yeah.
If you say, if you can't define what a woman is, Keir Starmer, you are not going to be allowed.
Yeah.
That's where we want to get to um, tactically. Now, that's still not going to address the dark triad people and what they're doing. But I just think, how do we sort of shift the mass of the population
Hmm.
or a significant chunk of them away from this earlier mind virus, which they've consumed, the Kool-Aid they've drunk, or the software they've downloaded? How do we get the new software
Hmm.
uploaded? I mean, and that's tricky.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's clearly room for consilience, isn't there, really, between the natural sciences and different kind of thing there, because obviously coming from different, just because people are coming from different perspectives doesn't mean that either one of the other perspectives are going to be wrong. But
Yeah.
we can have an intersectional debate.
Oh,
But it's
that's a trigger
interesting.
word. That's a
Yeah,
trigger.
but it's interesting you're saying, because woke seems to be, and again, echoing kind of female psychology, it seems to be very focused on personality, like cult of personality, which is what I would say kind of maybe these dark triad people can end up as leaders in these. And all kind of criticism now certainly is ad hominem. It's just been basically all the criticisms on Trump ad hominem. If you try to criticize Kamala on a personal thing, that's not allowed.
But I should just I should just interject too that where we see these different dimensions. So in the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression does a massive survey of 50,000 American
Mm-hmm.
undergraduates each year. And I've actually managed to get a few questions in there. But what one of the things we see is that, if you ask a question, should a speaker be shouted down or blocked? Um, women are, if anything, slightly less likely than men to support that.
It
So
will be
on
less
certain
likely
questions,
on
that involve
overt aggression.
physically aggression or aggressive dominant, there I think the dark triad type is in
Yeah.
control. But then you take another question like, should a speaker who says that, trans is a mental disorder be allowed on campus? When it comes to any kind of protection from harm,
Yeah.
the women it's very female
Yeah.
dominated. And so it's the aspect of woke that is about harm protection is
Mhm.
heavily female. The aspect of woke that is about smashing the oppressor, I think, is not as female, perhaps. And so I think it's interesting, these different dimensions of this. Some of them are more female than others,
Mhm.
whereas the smashing of the shouting down actually picks up more your LGBTQ type. They are over-indexing on
Mhm.
that. So perhaps someone who is male but is either trans or gay
Mhm.
or bisexual will be much more on the
Yeah.
perhaps aggressive side of the woke.
Well, young women have more testosterone in than older women, so we do see kind of patterns where young women are more likely to engage in violence as they're young
Hmm.
in teenage years, but certainly not on the scale that men
Oh,
are.
interesting.
That's kind of research from Anne Campbell, who used to be, she's passed now, but she was my mentor. But what I'll say as well is, when women compete, it's a zero sum game generally. And what they do, there are evolutionary reasons why it's not they don't engage in direct violence more than men. I mean, men are built by evolution to fight other men, basically, and protect their kin. But women outsource violence to men, and so they're male allies certainly. Do you remember a few years ago there was on Mizzou, there was a woman who was protesting there, and then she was going, "We need some men over here. We need some
Oh,
men
yeah, yeah,
over
yeah.
here." That's a perfect example of that.
Oh, yeah. The other examples, of course, you look at the Antifa arrests, and
Mm,
it's mainly male, or at least assigned male at birth. But that's
yeah,
yeah. So it just depends on which facet we're looking at.
we'll turn to solutions now,
Hmm.
because I met you a couple of times at certain conferences in London, and the last one, I think it was the NACON conference. There was kind of a buzzword about progressive conservatism, and that kind of got me kind of thinking, well, what might that be? Because a lot of kind of traditional conservative kind of solutions to this, certainly for the woman question and the birth question, is to put women back in the kitchen, put women back in the domestic sphere. And I thought, well, it's not going to happen. You can't do that unless we suddenly become, an Islamic state or something and start enforcing that. So I was thinking of strategies, progressive strategies. It's like I don't really like the word say. I wouldn't call myself a feminist because feminists to me are people who want to dismantle patriarchy, regardless. You can be into women's rights and women's issues, but you're not a feminist unless you want to destroy the patriarchy and the family and all this kind of thing. So yeah, I was just looking at that, but let's hear your solutions.
Well, I mean, I guess what I would say, there's two aspects to this problem. One is making institutions reflect public opinion, because if you look at public opinion, as I have in the US, Britain, and Canada, using a 50-item survey, broadly speaking, the public are 2-to-1 against the woke position.
Mm-hmm.
That's an average, but broadly speaking, that's where they are. But the institutions are reflecting the woke position. So the first question is, how do we make the institutions better reflect where the public opinion is? The second question is, what do we do about perhaps public opinion, mainly among younger people, which is worrisome only insofar as I believe that those younger people, as they grow older, are going to bring their sensibilities. They are going to become the median voter and the median employee and leader. So we have to address the youth problem. But the first step is to say, how do we get the institutions looking like the public? And the only way to do that is to use elected government, the one institution that the public can control. Elected government needs to centralize power. Now, a lot of traditional libertarian right people don't like that. They're always talking about devolving power, getting smaller government. And I would say that is incredibly naive, and they are just being useful idiots for the woke cultural revolution. Actually, in this moment, what we need is to get power away from, for example, quangos and other government agencies back to the political center, which is the only part that, by the way, is scrutinized by the media and where people have a say. Everything else is behind closed doors, takes place in smoke-filled rooms, or probably not smoke-filled. So we need to get,
filled.
Yeah. So that means elected governments need to have a mandate to go in and essentially, mandate political neutrality, get rid of DEI, get rid of critical race theory in schools, all the indoctrination. And that's got to be done using very detailed guidance. We're seeing it work in the red states in America now, actually. And yes, there's a worry about, you abolish DEI and the universities will rename it something else. I mean, that's true. But on the other hand, if they're violating the spirit of the law, and you have detailed enough guidance, which is now guidelines are now 15 pages in some states, it's very hard for them to shapeshift and pretend they're not breaking the law. And so I think actually you can use government to bend and compel the other agencies and quangos, either abolish them or you just abolish the DEI, you make them politically neutral. Similarly, with schools, a much more rigorous inspection regime with follow through, with reporting to Parliament, with metrics, with people being fired. I think a whole series of these things. In Florida, for example, there is no question that there is a real chill on teaching critical race and gender ideology, and it's working. So I think it can work. It needs political stamina, and what that needs is right of center parties that are much more focused on culture. They cannot take the safe route and just talk about economics and foreign policy. And that means that's going to be a culture shift within parties. We've only seen that in the US. We really haven't seen it in Britain yet. We have not, I would argue, even seen it in Canada a little bit, but not that much. What is needed is the grassroots has got to take over their parties and eject the liberal conservatives, because the liberal conservatives, they represent nobody.
I would say eject feminists. Because I mean, DEI basically is a machine to recruit fellow travelers rather than by meritocracy. So, I mean, you're just putting more people in there who benefit from the system and are going to, continue the system. But it's completely failed because we're not going to.
The other thing too is if the first stage is about government reforming institutions and centralizing power away, which, by the way, I would include politicizing judicial appointments, very important to do. The US is the leader in that regard. Unfortunately, we have very woke judges coming out of the law schools.
Mm-hmm.
We have to guard against that by having politicized appointments with an aim, and sometime in the future, when we have more of a consensus in society, then we can allow the professionals to have more autonomy, but not when we have this deliberate attempt to subvert institutions. The other part of it is, I should say, is schooling, really, which is the battleground, and we cannot allow
Mm-hmm.
the level of indoctrination that is occurring in schools to continue to occur,
Mm-hmm.
whether that be on race, whether that be on national history, whether that be on gender.
Mm-hmm.
Um, that has to be almost the most important thing for a
Yeah.
conservative government, is to get control and to take on the educational establishment and win
Mm-hmm.
and beat them on this. I think
Yeah.
that's got to be a top priority.
It's kind of like, resembles something like Margaret Thatcher taking on the unions of the mines. In that kind of
Yeah,
sense. But I mean, do you think, the legacy, you're talking about woke lawyers, is
yeah.
that the legacy of Derek Bell and Kimberly Crenshaw? Because they specifically began in Harvard Law, didn't they? And the goal of critical race theory was to subvert the Constitution.
Yeah, I mean, I think if I had to say, there's no question that what they are learning is making some difference. However, more and more what we know is that the opinion of somebody who's 18 who sets foot on a campus between when they set foot on campus at age 18 and they leave age 21 or 22, their political opinions don't change very much. And so my view now, that might have been different 30 years ago, but my view now is the content of what they're getting isn't really making much difference. The big issue is you're getting very left liberal people selecting into law schools. And why are they left liberal? They're already left liberal in high school. And so
Mm-hmm.
my view is, in fact, we got to get at the high school education.
Yeah.
That's what's producing the indoctrination. The study I did in the US with Zach Goldberg, it appears in the book. Those who were exposed to the maximum number, I think, was six critical race and gender concepts,
Mm-hmm.
were about 50%, 50 to 100% more likely to express woke views, such as
Mm-hmm.
white guilt, such as support for affirmative action. It really worked, and that's controlling for a whole bunch of different other factors,
Mm-hmm.
such as their parents' beliefs, where they live, a whole bunch of things,
Yeah.
racial composition. So it works. The indoctrination in schools
Yeah.
works when the
And a
kids are
law
young.
degree is traditionally the route into a political career in the States, isn't it?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and so I guess my view is it's this broader culture of victimhood culture which they are imbibing in part through the classroom. Now, granted, social media is probably more important, but still, these multiple sources are reinforcing, celebrity culture, um, the media they consume, TikTok, plus the school. It's all reinforcing. Now,
Mm-hmm.
yes, young men are rebelling against that to a much higher degree, but certainly a lot of people who are then coming through that system are indoctrinated and then heading into the elite institutions
Mm-hmm.
that uphold these values. They're part of the elite, they uphold the elite values. So I think we have to break that transmission belt by
Mm-hmm.
reforming education.
Yeah, I think certainly kind of like pre-college education is very important in that. My kind of idea was giving women real choices, not forced choices. So in Scandinavia, for instance, they have family accommodations on campuses, and women have babies. They can, and
Mhm.
there's childcare. So I'm kind of putting together a research project now to look at basically have that kind of accommodation on campuses, which will say, you can have a family, you can have your education at the same time. You don't have to choose one or the other. And then later improving the status of older women in the workforce. Because at the minute you have an influx of kind of like graduates, young women with no life experience, no children, no or any of that, and women kind of coming. Well, I'm one of them who raise their families and then go back into the workforce. They're just kind of the dregs, really. It's kind of like they
Right.
look at you like horrified. It's kind of like, oh my god, you're in a starting position, and you're like,
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, how because certainly when it comes also to the birth rate issue,
mm-hmm.
making it easier for people to enter into a career later, enter and exit
Mm-hmm.
easily. I mean, that's quite important,
Yeah. Well, Hungary are doing these kinds. They're doing a lot of but also as well, if we can do that and women can make these real choices and facilitate a female life trajectory history rather than pushing them into a male life history, it will also, I think, at some point getting women who maybe having families, have young children on campuses, it will inoculate them really against the kind of feminist indoctrination that happens in those campuses.
That's
And
that's
also,
that's yeah.
it will put a stop to hookup culture, which is feeding women's depression, things on that. So obviously the operational sex ratio on campuses, more women, less men, puts men in the driver's seat when it comes to those kinds of things, which is why we have hookup cultures now and women.
Right.
And yeah, so
I mean, it's interesting because obviously you hear different messages. I'm not an expert on this, that
mm-hmm.
the young people are having less sex. Now, obviously, women, it's the numbers you get it's almost like 30% are LGBT. I mean, if you take women in the fire surveys, answering the
Mm-hmm.
fire surveys, it's around 30% or 25%
Yeah, I
who
mean,
are
that might be an expression of their disenchantment with hookup culture.
right. But apparently young people are having less sex, so it doesn't, I mean, part of it could be that a small number of people are having a lot of sex and maybe a lot are having
Yeah, and
much less
yeah,
than they did. I mean,
online dating kind of helps that. It kind of favors the male.
well, some males, but it's also, there's a lot who are losing out, incels and so on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. My
It's,
colleague William Costello
yeah,
kind of
yeah.
doing a lot of work
But
on that.
But I mean, yeah, I think the other thing too, I think is this, more traditional feminist or trad femme or whatever tendency. I mean, to the extent that it gains force or some other alternative version of femininity can
Yeah.
gain power in the culture, I think that's probably going to be enormous if that
So yeah,
happens.
that's kind of my idea. It's not to put women back in the kitchen.
Right.
It's to kind of take, the opportunities we have now and basically facilitate women just having real choice. Using, female choice is a evolutionary mechanism. It's one of the most powerful mechanisms in the universe. And feminism is against that, basically. You've probably seen that article saying choice feminism is not
Right.
feminism.
Right.
It's against women making their own choices. You have to follow the party. So if we can facilitate women and raise the status of mothers, raise the status of older women, I think that would be kind of part of it. But again, like you're saying, we need to get into the high school as well to tell women that they have more choices.
Yeah, I mean, so much of this is about rebalancing the culture,
Mm-hmm.
not going back, as you say, to women in the home, but having a better balance where multiple things are valued, motherhood plus career, whatever.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Um, and this can be done, I think, within a kind of classical liberal framework. So for example, it's a bit like saying, you can, if you want to have a career and do only your career, you can do that, but that shouldn't be elevated. It's a bit like, yes,
Yeah.
we're going to tolerate diversity, we're going to tolerate being gay, whatever, but we're not going to celebrate and foreground it. That's the problem is we've kind of flipped. It's a bit
Mm-hmm.
like saying you can put pronouns in your email signature if you want to, but when that becomes, well, why haven't you got your pronouns in your signature? You're not a good ally. You see,
Mm-hmm.
it's that flip from what Isaiah Berlin would call kind of negative, hey, let's tolerate difference type liberalism to positive, you must endorse this ideal.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what's happened with feminism. It's what's happened with the trans stuff. It's what another example might even be veiling, and it is in the Muslim world where, it's one thing to say if someone wants to wear a veil there, they can wear a veil. But
To
once
show
that
their,
becomes a
their.
norm and
Mm-hmm.
enforced, and that's when, so how do we prevent
Mm-hmm.
toleration from becoming compulsion? Same with
Yeah.
diversity, tolerating diversity. No, now you must celebrate and prefer diversity. That's
Mm-hmm.
coercive. But we've kind of made that switch now. Someone like Patrick Deneen would say that's inevitable in liberalism. I'm a bit more optimistic. I think we can have the toleration of liberalism, the procedures of liberalism without the culture of conformity to the what I would call left modernist or cultural leftist
Mm-hmm.
ideal. I don't think we need, I think we can rebalance against, it's a bit like with women, we can rebalance, we can still tolerate or allow women to be
Yeah. Well,
career women.
I'm not a typical woman, so
Yeah,
it's not about kind of prescribing
Yeah.
a certain role, a gender role, whatever. It's about introducing real choice for the individuals to, I don't know, self-actuate based on their individual talents and,
Mm.
and what they can, provide to society, basically, how they're going to thrive.
Sorry,
Mm.
sorry. Well, it kind of requires a society not to be biased against one of those choices the way it is now, right? So
Mm. Yeah.
we have a very asymmetric, slanted landscape that
Mm.
values certain choices and it attacks other choices as being
Mm.
conservative,
And
regressive.
that's on both sides as well, because obviously you have the trad wife kind of thing, and it's kind of lots of conservatives put women back in that role. You still, so did you see the clip on Stephen Crowder telling his wife if she wasn't going to do wifely things, he wasn't going to give her the car and stuff like that.
Oh, okay. No, I didn't see that. Yeah.
That kind of conservatism, just pushing, or what we see in the red pill community. Say, I think that's a resurgence of male chauvinism to counter what we see as female chauvinism in feminism.
Hmm.
So these two things are kind of clashing together.
Well,
But
that's where so much of this is about optimization. What I talk about in the book is getting away from maximizing, like feminism, it's about maximalism for
mm-hmm,
a certain kind of ideal of womanhood, or for on the race stuff, it might be maximizing the uh, well-being of minorities, or not the well-being, but maximizing what they want against whites.
mm-hmm,
We should be moving towards kind of an optimal
mm-hmm.
balance between these things that allows for the greatest good of the greatest number,
Yeah,
um,
yeah.
human flourishing. That should be guiding us, not these narrow maximalisms that we tend to see.
Yeah, because I think all of these ideologies, like I said before, and we might disagree on that, are basically just for elites to gain power over plebs. Uh,
Right. Yeah. Well, I guess I'm more of a believer in that people have caught a mind, people are catching these different mind viruses and that's taking them over. I'm
oh
not
yeah,
as,
I think
I
there are
mean,
useless idiots, the useless
yeah,
idiots
yeah.
certainly, and the ideological cannon fodder, young people who go on this trans journey and end up mutilating themselves. This is again, what you'd say, ultimately they're creating a kind of infertile eunuch worker class
Mm.
that have no future kind of evolutionary benefit. This ideology murders their evolutionary potential.
Right. Well, I mean,
Um,
I guess it's because we have, I guess there's this debate over how much of this is, deliberate, the dark triad types for competitive reasons of power and status and wealth,
mhm,
they're driving it, or is it more of a bottom up kind of COVID style?
yeah.
I'm more of a believer in the bottom up emergent. Now, I don't say that there aren't people who are benefiting from this. I
Oh
just think
no,
that's
yeah.
secondary in a way. I think it's primarily about bad ideas needing to be, and we need to find um, you know, what is it, the vaccine in a way, the mind vaccine against
Mhm,
these viruses, and to actually push them back
mhm.
with
I
better
agree. I think it's bottom
ideas.
up, but I think it's kind of coming from evolved human nature. I think people don't realize that they're following an evolutionary propensity there, and the path to hell is paved with good intentions. That kind of thing.
Right, right. Yeah, and in a way, these mind viruses, they make use of our evolutionary mechanisms. So it's kind of like an autoimmune disease that a lot of these people have picked
Mhm.
up. It's a bit like
Yeah.
when you get a flu, it uses your own immune system
Mhm.
against you. And I think
Yeah.
this is what this is doing.
Yeah, well, people have this idea of evolution of kind of like a constant progression towards some kind of, and it's not. In evolution we see all the time selections to extinction. So there are a lot of bottlenecks that we
Mm.
just don't see. Okay, shall we call it a day then? And do
Yeah,
you?
that's been great, Paul. I've really
Yeah,
enjoyed it, and hearing a bit more of
mhm,
the feminist debate, and a
yeah,
bit where that fits into this, right? I
mhm,
think that's and I think it's absolutely central. You're right. I mean, I think even if it's not as sacred as race in the hierarchy, I think it's
mhm.
it's a major driving force.
Well, I think it's female psychology
Uh,
mainly because I think, as I was talking about the difference between kind of like narcissism and chauvinism, even non-feminists are susceptible to the idea that women are great.
and there's a degree to which you can be kind of pro-woman in a sort of what Jonathan Haidt would call he contrasts the sort of zero sum with a kind of oh God, what's the term that he used? It's more of a, you can have a positive sum type female identity and a zero sum female identity.
Mhm.
And I think having that kind of positive sum female
Mhm.
identity is absolutely fine. There's nothing wrong with having.
Yeah, I agree with you, but I think what we need to do is study female psychology more, study female intersexual competition more, because that is becoming more manifest as an invisible hand in our culture. Because at the minute, female psychology, well, not at the minute, female psychology generally is zero sum. When you get into conflicts, it's kind of eliminate the enemy. It's not like men that you can kind of like, get in a dominance position, good boy, now, you're part of the team, but know your place kind of thing.
Right,
It's,
right. Oh, interesting.
yeah.
Interesting.
But yeah, so
Okay.
where can we find your book?
Yeah, so if my book in Britain is Taboo, and you can just go to Amazon, and if you just put my name and
Mm-hmm.
Taboo, you'll find that. In the U.S., if you have any North Americans who watch, it's called The Third Awakening. So yeah, and then I've also got my course on woke, 15-week course at the University of Buckingham,
Mm-hmm.
which is open to anybody and so anyone in the world. So
Okay.
please do check that out as well.
I might
And
come and rabble rouse.
okay, all right. Great, Paula. Well, that's tremendous.
Okay, that's
Thanks
great.
very much.